Inside of the Soviet Union, there was tremendous anger and immense hatred that the Soviet people felt toward the German soldiers and those who occupied their lands following the launch of Operation Barbarossa. Thousands of women were subjected to terrifying ordeals at the hands of the German forces. And when the tide of the war turned, the Soviets inflicted a significant amount of vengeance and carried out large-scale public executions, even while the war was still going on. In cities which had suffered greatly, such as Leningrad or Minsk, German soldiers and SS officers were led up onto huge gallows platforms, and then the executioners secured the nooses around their necks in front of crowds of thousands. These men struggled and suffered a fate by slow strangulation, and they were left kicking for many minutes until their bodies went limp and death came. But why were German soldiers publicly hanged during World War II? The Soviet Union had suffered tremendously during World War II, and the Soviet people had been massacred and terrorized in massive killings. Thousands were shot by Einsatzgruppen death squads, the Nazi death squads who followed the advances of the German army. Many were shot in large pits, and a single executioner fired a bullet into their necks. These massacres were very well known across the lands, and Joseph Stalin, to begin with, had actually signed a non-aggression pact with the Nazis, and he was humiliated when his lands were invaded. But the Soviet forces following the Battle of Stalingrad had the upper hand, and they then began to regain territory and control of towns and cities. They would eventually push the Axis forces back toward Germany and their homelands. And when they reclaimed their lands, they decided to inflict retribution and vengeance in the form of public executions. Often these executions took place inside of towns and cities and places where hundreds of thousands of people could be gathered to witness the proceedings. These public hangings followed court proceedings and trials, but these were often predetermined and were heavily publicized. Public hangings were not random acts of brutality. They were a deliberate instrument of Soviet state policy designed to punish war criminals, deter further atrocities, and also boost Stalin's approval ratings. Many had in the dark times questioned the dictator, but by carrying out huge public executions of his enemies, Stalin had the opportunity to show his people that he was ruthlessly ordering justice and vengeance for them. One reason why the executions took place, even while World War II was still being fought, was that the executions were direct acts of retribution for mass atrocities in occupied Soviet territory. When Soviet forces liberated towns and villages previously occupied by the Wehrmacht, the SS, and auxiliary units, they encountered overwhelming evidence of systematic violence. They found mass graves of civilians and prisoners of war, burned villages and destroyed infrastructure, even coming across torture chambers and execution pits. And they also found evidence of starvation deaths caused by forced labor. But among the female population, they also found evidence of the horrors they suffered too. Entire communities had been annihilated during anti-partisan reprisals in places such as Smolensk, Minsk, and later in Poland and in the Baltic region. Investigators documented thousands of murdered civilians. Public hangings were intended to serve as visible retribution for these crimes. The Soviet state framed the executions as justice for the dead rather than simple revenge. Charges brought against German soldiers often included participation in mass shootings, burning civilians alive in buildings or barns, deportations and murder of forced laborers, torture of prisoners and partisans, and collective punishments of innocent villages. By hanging perpetrators in the same towns and cities where crimes had occurred, such as during the siege of Leningrad, the authorities created a symbolic link between crime and punishment. Also, public executions were, in a sense, psychological weapons. They aimed to deter remaining German forces from committing crimes. As the front lines moved westward, German troops were still fighting across Eastern Europe. The visibility of public hangings sent a message that war crimes would not go unpunished, and that capture did not guarantee leniency. Also, individual soldiers would be held personally accountable for their crimes. This undermined German morale and reinforced the fear that surrender might expose perpetrators of war crimes to public justice. But as well as German soldiers, this served as a warning to collaborators too. Local collaborators such as police auxiliaries, informants, And anti-partisan units were also meant to see the consequences of cooperation with the occupiers. Public hangings reinforced Soviet authority, as liberated territory was recaptured by Soviet administrations. The public hangings also served as an attempt to restore civilian morale and a sense of justice. Soviet civilians had endured some of the worst civilian losses in human history. Around 27 million Soviet citizens died during the war, and many of these were under occupation. Whole communities had watched their relatives being executed or deported. The sight of perpetrators punished publicly offered emotional closure, an assertion that justice had returned, and it served as proof that the state was avenging the suffering of the people. Crowds who flocked to see these public executions were also very large, and survivors identified perpetrators themselves during the trials. And the events were staged deliberately to reinforce the legitimacy of Stalin's justice. Alongside this, they also served as important propaganda tools. Inside the Soviet Union, photographs and newsreels showed captured German officers and soldiers being sentenced and civilians witnessing justice. This reinforced a message that the Soviets had defeated fascism and that Nazi war criminals would be punished. But internationally, the Soviet Union used the executions to demonstrate that the German crimes were real and were documented, and the appearance of a trial, even if it was rather poorly conducted, showed the world that they were going down the proper legal channels. As mentioned, even during the war years, captured German soldiers were being hanged in front of many thousands of Soviet people. But most public hangings also followed formal military tribunals, which carried the death penalty. The Soviet legal system included provisions for the punishment of fascist war criminals, and that witness testimony would be collected from civilians and people who had suffered. By using some form of evidence, it added validity to the hangings, but sentences often specified that death would take place by hanging rather than shooting. This was to emphasize the criminality of the condemned, as criminals were hanged and soldiers, well, they were normally shot. This also reduced the Germans to just criminals and not soldiers too, meaning they could not claim they were just following orders. It removed all form of military honor. Hanging was deliberately humiliating and visible, and it reinforced this message too. The condemned were also executed using slow strangulation, and there was no drop aimed to snap the necks of the Stasi men. This was done on purpose, as it meant that the men would struggle and suffer more in front of the crowds. And it could take many minutes for the men to be killed and then pronounced dead. It is important to stress that the overwhelming majority of German prisoners of war were not publicly executed. Many were sent to labor camps, where they succumbed to the terrible conditions. But many were also later repatriated back to Germany. Public hangings were reserved for documented war criminals, concentration camp personnel, officers involved in massacres, and collaborators whose information led to the deaths of civilians. The Soviet executions of German soldiers are still debated today, though some claim they were legitimate and necessary, but others deem them to be nothing more than vengeful killings, which only served to bolster Stalin's reputation and popularity. So, German soldiers were publicly hanged inside the Soviet Union to punish documented war criminals for their actions against civilians. They were also used to deter further collaboration in atrocities, and they attempted to restore justice. In communities which were devastated, these executions were not random brutality, but they were actually carefully calculated acts of state justice shaped by trauma, political necessity, and the unprecedented human cost of the Eastern Front. Thanks for watching. If you did find this video interesting, maybe click subscribe. Once again, thank you so much for watching one of these videos.